If you want to find out how Gnomaterial may not be as good as it's getting hyped up to be, you will 100% want to watch until the end of this video to find out. So getting right into this, what does the card do? Well, Gnomaterial... I see what you did there, Konami. Gnomaterial? No material? For the opponent? Why do I laugh at these things? Gnomaterial is a level 1 Earth Fairy effect monster with 0 attack and 1000 defense and the following effect. If your opponent special summons a monster while you control no cards, you can discard this card, then target one face-up monster your opponent controls. This turn, that monster cannot be tributed or used as material for a fusion, synchro, exceed, or link summon. You can only use this effect of Gnomaterial once per turn. So alright, that at first glance definitely sounds like it's absolutely amazing. I mean, let's start with the fact that your opponent basically cannot summon anything from the extra deck. There's no link climbing into anything either. If they target with no material, that monster cannot be used as material for anything. And it's important to note that it says monsters cannot be tributed as well, because that also means for ritual decks this is a great counter as well, because this stops ritual decks in its tracks. And then obviously because you're preventing tributing, you just cannot tribute summon at all. Or if there are effects like, for example, Blackwing Steam the Cloak, then you cannot use that Blackwing monster's effect in order to tribute your monster to clear it off the field. So basically, if you use no material, that monster is stuck there for the rest of the turn, which can honestly be quite scary. I mean, it potentially locks the opponent out of the extra deck for the rest of the turn. And does that ring a bell to anybody? Well, maybe. It sounds a lot like Dimensional Barrier. And Dimensional Barrier, I mean, who doesn't remember Zodiac format? Anyone who didn't play Zodiac format, Blade? Oh, yeah. But yeah, this card definitely sounds a lot similar to a card like Dimensional Barrier. And speaking of Dimensional Barrier, let's get right into the strengths of this deck. So some of the strengths include, first off, is it a New Age Dimensional Barrier? We'll talk about some of the flaws of this card in a little while. However, let's talk about the fact that it could potentially be a New Age Dimensional Barrier. This is already very similar to Dimensional Barrier. If you're going to activate Dimensional Barrier, then your opponent can't do any extra deck summons. However, the one issue is your opponent actually can do an extra deck summon with Dimensional Barrier, and they can link summon because the text doesn't include link summoning on Dimensional Barrier, because obviously Dimensional Barrier was printed before and everything, but that's besides the point. So yeah, no material can be used to stop link summoning, which is actually a really big deal because obviously, again, that prevents link climbing. It can hit links. So yes, this is a New Age Dimensional Barrier in that sense. However, one thing no material doesn't really stop is pendulum summoning. So can we equate no material to Dimensional Barrier? No material is kind of a separate beast from Dimensional Barrier altogether. No material can lock the opponent out of the extra monster zone also depending on what happens. For example, if they summon a Nightmare Phoenix into the extra monster zone, well, at that point they can't really do anything, because obviously they don't have any arrows pointing to yourself, and you just use the no material on the Nightmare Phoenix. Now, one issue no material will have in the future is the fact that obviously it doesn't include any text to prevent any future extra deck summoning mechanics that come out in the future, so no material will eventually be power creeps like Dimensional Barrier was, but we're talking about for the time being right now, so we're gonna ignore that factor. Another massive strength with no material is it super punishes link climbing. So for example, if you, again, using the Nightmare Phoenix example, but in this case we're talking about Orcus, if they link summon for a Nightmare Phoenix or a Nightmare Cerberus, and you activate no material, well, who's playing Orcus literally just lost the entire duel. Not necessarily lost the entire duel, but at the same time, they basically lose that first turn power that they should have had, because now they can't summon anything from the extra deck, and they don't get access to Mermaid either. Because obviously, to get access to Mermaid, you need to summon your Nightmare Phoenix. And if you summon your Nightmare Phoenix and it gets no material, well then it can't be used for link summoning for a Mermaid, which doesn't get you access to your Orcus stuff, and you're literally going to lose the game most likely if you get no Material. But you may not lose the game because there's other flaws, which again we'll get to. There's also the potential of hitting guard dragons, which is relevant because if you get hit with no material on a guard dragon, you cannot summon any other monsters for the rest of the turn except dragon monsters, which is obviously a big deal because that makes guard dragons effectively much worse. We also have the Salamangreat matchup, which this card's actually surprisingly really good against as well, except not really surprisingly. If you hit the no material on the Balinks, their turn 1 board becomes incredibly lackluster. Basically, if you hit it on the first Balinks, then that means that first off, they can't reincarnation link the Balinks into a second Balinks to keep that protection. They don't get to reincarnation link, they have a Balinks stuck in the extra monster zone when you usually want that to be a reincarnated Sunlight Wolf, so really it's not that optimal. It's not necessarily the end of the world. I mean, they can end on a Sunlight Wolf reincarnated with Balinks in the extra monster zone and Sunlight Wolf pointing down to it, being at the zone Balinks is pointing to, but at the same time, first off, you're not recurring anything off of Sunlight Wolf at that point other than a spell and trap, and you're not gaining any protection, you're just getting pluses that don't necessarily equate to any necessary value. So I think another big deal is the fact that obviously it doesn't have to be the monster summon specifically. So if your opponent summons an Electromite and they have a Dark Worm on the board, or for example they Pendulum summon and they have a Dark Worm on the board, and you don't want them to go into Guard Dragon plays, well then you can use this on that Dark Worm and then they cannot go into any extra deck summons, which obviously can be a big deal because then that cuts out the entire Guard Dragon package, which can set up 2 disruptions. So really those are the main strengths with this card. I mean, it's pretty straightforward because of the fact that obviously this card is pretty straightforward when it comes to its strengths, being able to stop extra deck summoning. I mean, hey, it's called no material for a reason. I know, it's hilarious. But before we start talking about the flaws of this card, because I mean, these are some really big flaws we're going to get into, a quick word from today's sponsor. If you guys want some pretty noise playmats, and by pretty noise, I mean the nicest of noise, the top-notch noise, the noise, you'll 100% want to go check out ImperiumDuelist.com and use promo code BladeYGO10 at checkout for 10% off any order. With that, let's get into the meatiest of meats, the flaws of noise material. Get what I did there? No material, noise material. Alright, I'll just get into the flaws. I still thought it was clever though. So getting into the flaws, you cannot control any cards at all. And obviously this is a big deal because you cannot go first when using no material. If you're going first and you draw no material, well then it's basically a dead card because you're probably going to put something on your board. You're probably not just going to end the turn immediately. So because of this clause for it to only be when going second, I would say this is a side deck only card. You would not be main decking this card unless you're a going second deck. But really this format, there aren't any going second decks right now, I would say, that are relevant. So I would argue and make the point that, yeah, that factor is not relevant as of right now. However, I think one of the biggest issues with this card immediately is the fact that it conflicts with one of the other biggest side deck cards of this format, Phantasme. Or if you're maining Phantasme, then no material also conflicts there. So to be fair, if you draw no material and Phantasme, you can use both of them still, which isn't necessarily a problem at all. But Phantasme does conflict with no material. If you draw no material off of Phantasme, then in that case, it's basically a dead card. And if you're going first and you draw no material and no Phantasme, well then obviously you can use no material. But my point here is there are some conflictions. Now, you can make the argument that, Blade, I'd rather have my draws and dig for another out. Well, Timmy, the thing is, would you rather try to dig for an out or actually have drawn the out instead? Blade, I'm a lucky guy, I got this. So yeah, no, really depends on the player and the deck for this situation, but I thought it was noteworthy. Phantasme is better in some scenarios, no material in others. Another flaw is that this isn't always a blowout card. So Dimensional Barrier was a blowout card because obviously it's a continuous effect for the rest of the turn. One of the big differences is that Gnomaterial only stops one monster, and so yes, you can make the argument that it locks out of zone entirely, but it first off doesn't negate the effects of that monster, which means they can still go ahead and use the effects. And also, this card only stops one card, which I've already mentioned isn't like a lingering effect or anything. What I mean by that is like it doesn't linger onto the entire opponent's field. It only affects one monster, and that's a big deal because it's not nearly as powerful as Dimensional Barrier was. And also another issue is you can't always use it on the extra monster zone because sometimes your opponent's going to set up a negate before you can do that. For example, with the Endymion deck, your opponent can easily set up a Jackal King before you have the opportunity to use a card like Gnomaterial or Ash or any other hand trap. So with that in mind, I would make the argument that it is not a new age Dimensional Barrier. It can't be used going first, and establishing any other card on your field turns it off. And as well, Gnomaterial isn't always good against every deck. One deck this card isn't necessarily as great against is Striker. Now obviously you can stop your opponent for the rest of the turn, but this is easily a neg1 in the Striker matchup, and specifically the Striker Mirror. And obviously it's not as good because your opponent's not really link summoning that much. They're basically not gaining a +1, but you're going neg1, which in turn can potentially make their life easier or make their life worse. But if they didn't draw Engage, then obviously they would have gone Shizuku before anything else. So it really depends on the scenario, but usually Gnomaterial is a neg1 in the Striker matchup. There are also other matchups as well, like True Draco, etc., that don't really get affected by Gnomaterial. Speaking of it being a neg1, let's talk about that. Gnomaterial isn't a lingering effect on the entire field, and it's a neg1, which is obviously a big deal because of the fact that even though it prevents them from using it as a material, you also have to discard in order to use Gnomaterial as an effect. So while you're not getting a 1-for-1 trade, like for example with Ash Blossom on something or Ghost Ogre on something, Gnomaterial basically says, okay, I will stop you from doing this. It's very similar to Droll in that sense, because Droll and Logbird is a neg1 inherently, but it gives a powerful effect. Now, if we're valuing Gnomaterial as the same power, if not more powerful, then obviously it'd be worth it to play Gnomaterial just in general because it's so powerful. But at the same time, I don't think it's worth it to be playing a card that's less powerful than Droll and Logbird, because I think we could arguably agree that Gnomaterial isn't as powerful as Droll and Logbird. And one other thing as well is that Gnomaterial doesn't actually stop any effects. So obviously, yes, you can stop them from summoning cards from the extra deck, but at the same time, it doesn't like stop the effects of the monster it targets or anything. Maybe, for example, if it was a link or something, then it could negate the effects as well, which would make the card even better. But at the same time, it wouldn't have needed some extra value in order to make it less of a neg1. But because it's a neg1, your opponent can just pass, and if you can't beat them in one turn, then they can just make a comeback on their next turn. The last flaw I'm going to mention is only on special summon, so just real quick. Basically, there are ways to play around it, like again with the Jackal King example that I've already stated, but because it's only on special summon, that means that you can't use it at any point, and that means that your opponent can play through it at times. So what is the main application with this card? Well, again, it's a side deck card. It's not going to be in the main deck because anytime you go first, it's an absolutely dead card. It can potentially stop combo decks if timed properly. However, potentially is the key word in this scenario. It doesn't necessarily guarantee to stop them, and usually combo decks can still set up multiple disruption or make your opponent go neg further if you're using Gnomaterial. Like a lot of the time, for example, if you're playing against Danger Thunder Dragon, if you're using this against a card like Guard Dragon LP, then they can still keep pushing and do more and more. They can go into Aggro Pain and then summon a monster from the extra deck and just leave those two on board and just be able to go from there into Dark Matter, and you're still setting up a really optimal board, plus you've probably taken 2 cards out of your opponent's hand at that point. So really, Gnomaterial doesn't necessarily stop these combo decks entirely. entirely. In the end, this card is weird. I want to absolutely love it, but at the same time, after taking a closer look, it's definitely not as good as it's being hyped to be. I could be wrong, however, and with that, we'll have to see how this format develops in the 2019 Dark Neostorm competitive metagame. Before you go, make sure you guys subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to watch more videos like this one. With that, I'll see you guys soon.